So for those of you who haven't heard the story, Liz Hoagie was supposed to be our speaker tonight, and I got a call from her this afternoon. I didn't get the message till mid-afternoon saying that she was in Washington, D.C. and was fogged in and was not going to be able to make it. So I didn't see how there was any way we were going to be able to have a lecture tonight. But fortunately, Liz and Dave are colleagues and friends, and she called Dave, and Dave was available and ready, willing to switch his March talk with her. So Dave is here tonight, and Liz will be speaking in March. So David Vago is an instructor in psychiatry and associate psychologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital, affiliated with Harvard Medical School. Dave has completed postdoctoral fellowships at the Brigham and Women's, at the Stuart T. Hauser Research Training Program, and at the University of Utah Medical School. He has also been Senior Research Coordinator for the Mind and Life Institute and is currently a Mind and Life Fellow. I think he's also been involved with the Buddhist Geeks organization, is that right? Yeah. And Dave is here tonight to talk about deconstructing mindfulness. So I'm going to move this over here.
Okay, well, thank you all for being flexible. I think that's a good skill for stress and resilience, which we were all hoping to hear about tonight. I may not be as beautiful as Liz, but I hope to at least be able to talk somewhat to the topics that she was going to talk about tonight. I like to and thank you, Tom, and thank you all again just for being here. I'd like to start by I start with this slide because I create a contrast in my work between the 2,500-year-old historical Buddhist model of cultivating mindfulness, which is depicted here in this Tibetan Thangka painting that was actually on a wall in Norbalinka Institute in Dharamsala. And it depicts the stages of shamatha, or the stages of meditation that are associated with calming the mind. And it's a really beautiful painting. It's my favorite Thangka. It really depicts the essence of what is occurring while you're cultivating mindfulness through concentration practice. And I'll give you a little bit of tour. Is everyone familiar with this painting? No? Okay, so I'll give you a quick tour of it because it's really beautiful. And of course, the goal here from the 2,500-year-old model is enlightenment. And just for contrast's sake, I put a picture of John Kabat-Zinn and his mindfulness-based stress reduction workbook on the right as contrast, because this is the 25-year-old contemporary model for cultivating mindfulness. And there's definitely some similarities, but there's a lot of stark differences. And so my job has been to sort of try to integrate the two models, given the problematic sort of differences that exist between enlightenment and stress reduction as a goal. So that's where I come in, and that's where me and my colleagues have been trying to use more psychological and cognitive terms and framework in order to translate some of the more historical perspectives without sort of unwittingly ignoring or dismissing these sort of really subtle states that are manifest in the historical model. So what you see here is actually a practitioner in the red robe in the beginning of the path with a rope and an axe in his hand. And he's advancing through the path, chasing an elephant, which is led by a monkey. And the elephant represents the mind. And in this case, an untamed elephant can wreak a lot of havoc and cause a lot of destruction, running rampant. And just like your mind, untrained, can also cause a lot of harm and stress and a lot of destructive emotions. It's led by a monkey, and the monkey represents distraction. And is everyone familiar with the concept monkey mind? most of you? Well, the idea, again, is you close your eyes, and where does it go? It jumps from sort of limb to limb, or thought to thought, like a monkey would on a tree. You also see a flame at the beginning of the path that's quite big, and as you progress through the path, the flame goes down. This means that in the beginning of the practice, it's quite effortful and takes a lot of effort. And so it's important when we look at this model, because it truly is a model. Each thing that I'm talking about can be modeled in the more contemporary sort of psychological and cognitive sort of way. And that's how we're sort of breaking down mindfulness and deconstructing it, because it turns out that a novice practitioner is going to take a lot of effort to do the practice. And if you look at even patients who go through these sort of mindfulness-based stress reduction courses, you see the symptoms actually getting worse in the first few weeks. And people are like, well, what's going on? It's supposed to be mindfulness, it's supposed to be great. But it turns out that it's just difficult to sit, especially if you've never done it before, as we've all experienced. So what you see is the dramatic shift between probably week 3 and 4 and week 8. And so effort is really a strong component of the model that we try to incorporate. And the elephant goes from black to white, and that represents the dullness. So there's a lot of dullness in the beginning, and as it becomes more white, it gains clarity. And so clarity is another component that the Buddhist model talks about, specifically, say, the Satipatthana Sutta specifically talks about clarity, and the Visuddhimagga also refers to clarity. And this is seeing things as they truly are, and this is what happens when you start insight practice, for example. And so as you can see, as you continue along the path of shamatha, or calming the mind, eventually the elephant goes behind the practitioner and is led by the practitioner. It's no longer leading the practitioner. It's no longer in front of the practitioner. And the monkey also is behind, so distraction is tame. And at the end, the mind sits at the side of the practitioner. It's very calm, it's very stable. And that's an important aspect of the practice, is to really tame the mind and sort of make it, put it in a calm state. And then in this particular model, insight practice is supposed to follow, and that's what happens after. That's where the rainbows are. That's insight, seeing things as they truly are. So we use some of those concepts in the models that we've created in trying to integrate the two different sort of the 2,500-year-old and the 25-year-old model. Okay? All right, can you advance? All right, so and you can advance again. So these are just forms of inspiration for me, and every person on the screen really has informed me and the work that I've done in a way that is truly sort of impacted everything that I'll be presenting. And I really want to acknowledge all the people that have truly affected how I see mindfulness and how I've been working with mindfulness. And of course, you have to have teachers for my own practice, and that's also been a critical part of insight into how these processes function. There's a really strong component of personal practice for anybody who is a therapist or a scientist who's trying to investigate these things. So we can get a second person perspective into what mindfulness is truly doing. And so, again, I thank all these people. So you can move through. And this is just acknowledge my lab, because we are working and we are committed to doing this type of work at the Brigham. And there's a big team of people who are interested. And we work a little bit with Shinzen Young as well. And he's another Buddhist teacher that we work with specifically. Okay, so I'll walk you through deconstructing mindfulness, giving you a few clarifications about what we mean by mindfulness, because as of now, there are 8 self-report measures in the field, and which measure mindfulness. So, do you have mindfulness or not? Take these, self-report measures. It turns out that they're often uncorrelated with each other, and that's problematic in a laboratory setting. So, we have to sort of deconstruct it into sort of component parts and really identify a better way, a more objective way to study what we mean by mindfulness. It's a complicated concept. We can move again. So I focus on habit formation, bias, and suffering. And these are sort of concepts that really come from both the Buddhist model and the more contemporary model of mindfulness. We talk specifically about the sort of common sort of goal that they have together. Both models are interested in reducing suffering and creating a healthy mind. And so I'll come back to that as being a critical sort of broad framework for mindfulness. It's reducing bias, and which is a form of suffering in the more contemporary model, and describing what we mean by suffering, and then what a healthy mind is. And I focus specifically on the self to understand the mechanisms of mindfulness. When we talk about the self in terms of brain processing, we can really identify very specific aspects of self-processing that are not just, there's not just one, so there's multiple, and I'll try to delineate what those aspects of self are, and hopefully it'll help you as well. I'm just getting a sense, how many people here are actually clinicians and work with patients? Okay, so the majority of you, so I'll try to make it most relevant to you. So then we'll talk about methods that are supposed to increase mindfulness, and I'll focus on one particular, and then some conclusions, and we'll talk. And most of the work that I'll be referring to comes from these two papers. If you're interested in getting the papers, feel free to email me, and I can provide them to you.
Just so people know, your paper is on our website.
Oh, great! The Frontiers paper.
The self-awareness paper.
Oh, great! Yeah. So it says self-awareness, self-regulation, self-transcendence, and these are aspects I'll come back to what I mean by that. But the idea here is I'm working from aspects of self-processing to basically illustrate how the mechanisms of mindfulness function, using the self as a model or framework. And this is done with my colleagues, Sarah Lazar's lab, with Britta and Tim and Zev. Some of you may already know. Okay, so what is mindfulness? We're always wondering, what is mindfulness? So you can just go to the next one. This is the definition that most of us understand. I'm not going to focus too much on it, but we all should be familiar with this. And the next sort of slide. So this definition that John refers to really refers to this state of mindfulness. What happens when we're currently being mindful? And we can think of this as mindful awareness. We also describe this as a discriminative attentional capacity. So it's a form of attentional processing, and it's the state of mindfulness that we're referring to. But you can think of mindfulness as a state or a trait, so something that's dispositional in nature that you can cultivate maybe without meditation practice. So you can give people the self-report measures, and you can say, well, they range from this much to this much, and you can say, well, these people have more mindfulness than these people, even though they've never meditated. Well, what does that mean? What makes people different dispositionally on these scales of mindfulness? And there's different ways of categorizing or breaking down mindfulness and self-report, but we're trying to get at more objective ways of studying it. Okay, so what is mindfulness as an intervention? Most of us who are clinicians should be familiar with the MBSR sort of model. It's an 8-week program. You can just walk through these. The ways we describe these is 26 hours in 8 weekly group classes, 2.5 hours of class, an all-day class during the 6th week. The home practice, 45 minutes a day. There's concentration practice, insight practice, ethical practices like metta and compassion, forgiveness. And there's light hatha yoga. We can't forget about the yoga because yoga is a very powerful part of the 8-week program. Actually, if you look at some of the data that's out there, it shows that the yoga practice has more often correlated with the symptom reduction than the sitting practice. So we have to keep in mind that yoga is actually a critical part of the 8-week program. And just to give you a sense that what the data shows out there at this point, now let's keep in mind there's only been data on MBSR since probably 2004, maybe a little bit earlier. John's original 1982 paper was on pain reduction, was pretty significant, but they haven't been really consistent in terms of the treatment fidelity since like 2000. But they're increasing in numbers. And they vary in terms of how many classes are being used. The length of the classes. Sometimes they don't do an all-day class, sometimes they do. And the home practice ranges. Not everyone does it, not everyone's compliant. So how do we deal with all those differences when we're trying to really get a sense of what MBSR truly is, or what mindfulness is doing to people? So this is the basic sort of essence of an intervention. You can go to the next slide. So I like to think of mindfulness, at least in broad terms, for the purpose of deconstructing it. I think about in the next sort of points here, the point here I'm trying to make is that in broad terms, we can think of mindfulness as a path or a method, like we saw on the first slide on the Tanka painting. It's a path to reducing suffering and creating a healthy mind. That's the best way to describe mindfulness from the Satipatthana Sutta. It specifically talks about mindfulness as the path to purification. I mean, those aren't cognitive or psychological terms, so how do we define that in more terms that we can all understand? Reducing suffering and sustaining a healthy mind. And we'll unpack that as well. So we all can understand that we can lift weights and we get stronger muscles. Well, really, mindfulness is just a way of improving our mental function, but flexing the mental muscle. So that's one way to think about it. You're just training the mind. And in many cases, we just call this mental training or mind training. And so I think this is a really wonderful metaphor for people, especially as clinicians. I think you can probably understand or relate to this metaphor. But the idea here is protection and recovery. Those are two really clear sort of metaphors or really just aspects of mental health that we can stress. So in this picture, we have a raincoat which protects you from the rain. When you go outside tonight and you wear a coat, prevents you from getting wet. Same idea with mindfulness. In some sense, it's protecting you from having destructive emotions, from basically decompensating in some way and developing some form of psychopathology. It can help protect you from developing these types of destructive emotions or psychopathology. Now, there is the case that you could get wet or develop some sort of traumatic experience. So what happens? How do you deal with trauma? How does anybody deal with trauma? You need some form of mechanism to recover. And a towel is sort of that sort of metaphor for recovery. So being able to dry yourself off once you get wet. So that's one way to sort of think about sustaining a healthy mind. Okay, so in the next. So like I said, I focus on the self as a framework for understanding mindfulness. And when I talk about self, I talk about self-awareness. And what we really mean by that is removing the distortions of our self, from our perspective on others, how we see others, how we see the world around us. All these relate to biases from our previous experiences. And bias is has a very strong literature behind it. It's a very explicit construct that we can study in the laboratory setting. And you can see you have a cat looking. I mean, a lot of people have seen this picture before, but I think it's great because it really depicts what's happening. If the cat was going out onto the savannah thinking it was a lion, I don't think it would survive very long, thinking that it would be the king of the jungle, given its size. So again, we're trying to gain awareness, and this is removing the distortions of the self, of people around us, our relation to others, and the world. It's also an ability to effectively manage one's responses and impulses. And this we can broadly term self-regulation. So before we saw the elephant as representing the mind. In this case, we're regulating the mind. We're just controlling the mind. We're getting a sense of control over the mind. And then the last one, which is often underlooked, is this idea of self-transcendence. It's a positive relationship between self and other that transcends self-focused needs and increases pro-social behavior. And so I have a picture of a mother with their child, and it's the love that a mother has for a child is undeniable. We can all sort of say that a mother loves their child undeniably. The question is, can the practitioner generate such love and compassion for oneself, for others, for strangers, for people that they dislike? Now that's a tall order, but that's sort of the goals of practice. We can't forget that this is not just about attention training or emotion regulation, but it's also about the self-compassion, compassion for others, the empathy development. Okay, developing empathy and theory of mind is a huge skill, and it's a critical part of the mindfulness model. Okay, so next. So what is suffering? So, it's easy to just throw that term around. We sort of all have a sense of what is suffering. But from the Buddhist model, there's talk about habitual attachment and aversion. So pushing away the things we dislike and trying to cling to or grasp the things we like. right? And so we need to rid ourselves of that because that's suffering. Ignorance of impermanence, that things arise and pass. And the last one is the self is an independent and permanent entity, and this is sort of based on this inflated sense of self-importance or self-loathing. These are the aspects of suffering that the Buddhist model refers to. And I'd like to just point out a nice quote by Thera that is a great way sort of getting at exactly what more contemporary people think of suffering. The aims of these meditation practices are to achieve stability of mind. So we saw that in the first Thangka painting, a deeply penetrating awareness between laxity and hyperexcitability. I didn't talk about another aspect of the Thangka, but there's a rabbit on there, and the rabbit sits on top of on the elephant because it represents hyperarousal. And so you have to have some level of arousal, or else you're in sort of torpor, and you're falling asleep every time you practice. So there has to be a balance between excitability and torpor. Followed by a cessation of maladaptive emotions and cognitions. These are the impurities such as lustful desire, greed, hatred, worry, and the cultivation of virtuous qualities. And finally, the highest form of wisdom, which comes in insight practice, where you perceive the most fundamental nature of objects as they truly are, without distortions or biases inherent in habitual forms of cognition. So, we go to the next slide, and this should sound familiar to those who know Aaron Beck. Aaron Beck, of course, is like the father of cognitive behavioral models of psychopathology. And he says, you can go to the next, the processing of external events or internal stimuli is biased and therefore systematically distorts the individual's construction of his or her experience, leading to a variety of errors. Underlying these distorted interpretations are dysfunctional beliefs incorporated into relatively enduring cognitive structures or schemas. And these cognitive structures and schemas are how you see the world, how you see yourself, how you see your relation to others. These become crystallized over time. As you continually think the same patterns of thoughts, they will crystallize in how you see yourself, the world, and the people around you. And so you can go to the next. And what he shows is that in how he describes psychopathology, and by the way, this should sound familiar to the Buddhist model, because it's very similar. It's very similar. And actually, if you talk to him, he'll say, absolutely, the mindfulness model fits right into mine. In any case, his is more, there are differences, of course, because he uses a very cognitive approach at changing those biases. So reusing cognitive forms of reframing and trying to replace your old thoughts with more adaptive ones. Whereas mindfulness really focuses on just being aware of them, and they'll disappear as you just bring your awareness to them. So there are differences. But it's a good way to sort of see the contrast between the Buddhist and the contemporary. So he shows you have the adverse developmental experiences like trauma that lead to dysfunctional attitudes and cognitive vulnerability. Each time that there is some sort of reactivation of those memories, they will activate stress, the stress response, which lead to pervasive negative cognitive biases and eventually depression. And the next shows how eventually there's an exaggeration of stressful events, whether they're real or imagined. So they can be truly threatening, or they can be just imagined forms of threat. Either way, your brain doesn't make a difference. It still reacts to your own internal stress. And that leads to what is typically thought of as dominance of limbic activity over prefrontal activation. So is everyone sort of familiar with terms like prefrontal and limbic? I'll get a little bit into that, but the idea is that your emotional centers are sort of very highly reactive and without any sort of control by your prefrontal cortex. And that'll lead to these deficient reappraisal of negative cognitions and depressive symptoms. Okay, so like I said, we're really focusing on the self here and the distorted interpretations that arise as your perception of me. Who am I? And who am I before? Where did I come from? Am I the same person? What type of person am I? You describe yourself by thinking about you in the past. So you can go through one click. There's the two together. This is where they sort of meet. And then another click. So there's your past. You have an arrow relating to me. So your perceptions of yourself really refer to what you thought of yourself and your memories of the past. You also your perception of yourself in the moment also is dependent upon the next click about your perceptions of the future, and you can click on a few more slides here. Okay, so they're causally connected. Each perception of me in every moment that you have is causally connected to the past interpretations of me and the future interpretations of me. That's where your self resides. It's your interpretation, your evaluation of, it's the cognitive evaluation of yourself from the past and the future. We spend a lot of time doing that. The majority of our time when we're not doing anything, we are evaluating ourselves from the past, what we did, where we're coming from, and what we're going to do, or worrying about the past. So now I'm going to show you just the sort of the extreme end of distorted perceptions of oneself. And this leads to the depressive symptoms that Beck was talking to. But I want to emphasize that this doesn't mean that all of us have some varied degree of distorted perception and cognitions about ourselves and the world around us. Because we do. They're just not they don't fit into a form of psychopathology. So we have to be aware that there is some form of gradient that happens in our distorted perceptions that leads to extreme sort of perceptions. So I am worthless, life is unfair, my future is hopeless, and this is the model of depression that we're all familiar with, that a lot of us probably see in our patients. And this is the Beck triad. It's about I am worthless, myself in the current state, life in general is unfair, I'm being treated unfairly, and my future is hopeless. So this is all based on your perception of the past, what's going on around you, and the future and the world that is coming. And so, if you click again and again, there's negative feedback loops here. So if you're having whatever you're thinking about right now, that's influencing your perception of the past and influencing your perception of the future. And these dysfunctional attitudes lead to rumination, where you are just feeding the fire with the same negative thoughts, the same biases, the same distorted perceptions, and these negative self-focus leads to depression. And what we think of as a self-reification, or you're reifying or crystallizing how you see the self and the world around you. Yeah?
Could it be other dysfunctions besides depression, both this slide and the last slide, such as anxiety or other disorders?
Absolutely. And, but to be honest, there's a lot of overlap usually with anxiety and depression, so they're almost really difficult to tease apart, because anxiety relates to anticipations usually of the future. So in some sense, there is some sort of depressive constellation about how you see the future, but it's not as negative self-focus as, say, just a worry about, experiencing pain, for example. But there's similarities in terms of the distorted perceptions of the future in depression and anxiety. So at some level, both depressed patients and anxiety patients are going to have bias, some sort of attentional bias, and you can measure that. And so that's what we're really getting at, is that what is the suffering that depressive patients or anxiety patients or trauma patients are experiencing at some level of bias from the past or the future.
Thank you.
And so I wanted to also emphasize that these habits that you create are the biases that we create are habitual. So it's a habitual way of thinking. But it happens at two levels: a perceptual level, at a level that you may not even be aware of, so they're non-conscious forms of processing that are occurring as we see the world. Some people avoid pain-related information, sensory cues in the world. They completely avoid them without any conscious knowledge that they're doing that. It just becomes habitual bias that manifests over time. For example, I did some work with patients who were diagnosed with fibromyalgia, and they have chronic pain. And these patients showed a bias, a non-conscious bias that we were able to measure, away from or avoiding pain-related information. So we showed them pain-related words, and they were ignoring or avoiding those words. And then if we showed these words long enough, and this was at about, just to give you a sense of the timing, 150 milliseconds. So at 150 milliseconds, you can see something, you register it, but you're not processing it more than at a sensory level. only after about 300 milliseconds do you start to actually process something at a cognitive level. And that's when you first start to interpret what you see. So if we show these pain-related words for a long enough time, the patients would actually focus on the words and have trouble disengaging from them. So that's when they start processing things at a cognitive level. So if you click one more, there's an evaluative component that's also can be measured. So bias can actually be measured at two levels, an early perceptual non-conscious level and a more cognitive evaluative level. So you can have a distorted perception that's unconscious, you can be avoiding things at that level, or you can be avoiding things which are more strategic, like I will not look at anything that's pain-related or going to provide me any anxiety. And that's actually a form of emotion regulation. It's just maladaptive. And so what we really are left with is a distorted sliver of reality that are based on our agenda, our needs, our fears, our wants, expectations, attitudes, values, beliefs. All of this become interpreted under this bias, and everything that every sort of way we see the world and perceive the world and evaluate the world is just this sliver of reality that's depicted in the pictures below each person, especially in relation to how they see each other. Okay, so you can go on. So this again, we're back to this picture of the cat seeing this distorted perception of itself. So in order to give you a sense of the systems of self that we can measure in the brain, I have to sort of delineate the systems in a way that we can all sort of relate to. So we have I am, and I was, and I will be, and we can click through that, and that's sort of the evaluative and narrative sense of self that we were just referring to, how we interpret the world in a very cognitive way, how we tell our story. It's our autobiographical self. And then we have seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, feeling. These are the in-the-moment ways that we perceive the world, the qualia, the qualities in which we experience the world, right? And those are just systems of sensory systems specifically. And then we have that is mine, that is me acting or my action. So I know that these are my hands because I have a sense of agency. But we know that a lot of traumatic patients, for example, will experience dissociation. What is dissociation? It's actually distancing yourself from your own body, that you have this sort of almost like an out-of-body experience, that you have this numbing experience and you no longer sort of can relate to your own body. And that sense of agency can be measured specifically as well. And two more, we have meta-awareness, so being able to actually be aware of your own self and self-processing. So that distancing that we create can be a healthy way of seeing the self. And so all of these are affected by mindfulness, and I'm going to give you a sense of how they're modulated. And the last one that we talk about are these non-conscious sensory, affective, and motor processing that goes on. It's under the hood, essentially, of the self. These are stuff you don't know about. You have no sort of control over it, really. It's just happening. It's really how you orient your eyes and where your eyes fixate for your attention. It's trained at a very motor level. Your brainstem is controlling a lot of these things. So these are the automatic forms of processing that we have to condition or extinguish and recondition through our wonderful clinicians that we have around with us, right? So what is your job? Is to really sort of unravel the automatic sort of maladaptive behaviors and then recondition into more adaptive behaviors. And that you're really conditioning a lot of these non-conscious processing that hasn't been studied extensively, and we're still working on that. So so I give you this as an example. I think we all can relate to this picture. People have seen this picture from the New Yorker. It's just a great way of depicting what happens when we're having conversations and we're in the narrative too much. Give you a second to... So I think by looking at this, you get a sense of what we mean, what we all are familiar with is this idea of ruminating. and it happens even when we're listening to other people. So it's clearly sort of our default mode of where we go when we're doing nothing, or even when we're listening to other people. It's a very highly specified network of brain structures that are responsible for this, because it really constructs our perception of ourselves. And we spend a lot of time constructing, and not deconstructing, but constructing ourselves, who we are in every moment. And that's what's happening when we're doing this. We have to always maintain some continuity. Okay, you can go next. And so I hope you don't get too scared from pictures of the brain, but I'll explain them. The idea is now, how do we localize these systems in the brain? And we can do that. And again, everything that I'm giving you and talking to you about today comes from extensive research into the extant literature, where mindfulness, what aspects of the brain that mindfulness seems to be modulating, and what aspects of the self seem to be affected by some sort of dysfunction. So what we see here is the narrative self, the evaluative, more cognitive aspects of autobiographical recall, of self-processing, and it involves structures related to memory. We have, I'll just move a little bit. We have the posterior cingulate cortex, the retrosplenial cortex, and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which are very strongly connected to each other. And this is usually strongly implicated in evaluative processing, so any form of evaluation, which we're very good at, that takes place is going to activate this structure. In PCC, some of the literature now seems to suggest that is a really strong area for this sort of residing in the narrative sense of self. And back here, actually, all this area is called the posteromedial cortex. Parts of it is called the precuneus. It consumes more energy, 35% more glucose than any other part of your brain at rest. So it's pretty much doing something important. As you go into more unconscious states like sleep or coma, it decreases in its energy metabolism. So it's really important. So then we can overlay that with the experiential phenomenological self, and this comes from Ned Block, talks about phenomenological self in terms of conscious experience, and it sort of refers to that sense of agency, monitoring, focused attention without evaluation, working memory, maintaining set, so knowing what you're doing in the moment, you're sort of maintaining some sort of working model of what you're supposed to be doing. Even mental imagery from the first person perspective, and you'll see these areas that are specifically related to primary sensory processing. And the anterior insula is also a very highly evolved area of the brain that's responsible for interoception. So knowing what is going on inside you at all times highly activates this area. I can't represent it because it's hidden deep within the folds of the sylvian fissure here, but the most anterior portion of it is actually also about, it's much larger. It actually much larger than non-human primates. Non-human primates, macaque monkeys, for example, don't even have the anterior portion of the insula. There's these specialized neurons there called von Economo neurons that seem to be important for social behavior and empathy and theory of mind, how we interact with others. There's some theories that suggest that people with autism don't have those particular neurons, and those specialized neurons are not even present in there. But the anterior insula is one of the greatest areas of activation in mindfulness practitioners, and some of the most greatest decreases in activation across these studies in mindfulness have been in this PCC area or precuneus area, which seem to be really important for decreasing that sort of narrative processing. Because what is mindfulness doing? It's trying to get you out of the narrative and in the moment. So these lateralized structures, and remember, lateralized brain structures are really probably the most evolved areas of the brain. The brain evolves from the brain stem out. So as you go more lateral and frontal, you're going to get into the most highly evolved areas of the brain. So dorsolateral, ventrolateral brain areas are the most sort of goal-directed and sort of top-down controlling areas of our brain. They're responsible for maintaining sort of goal-driven actions and working memory and concentration. So dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is DLPFC, is really important for maintaining concentration. Okay, so that's the experiential. And we're overlaying on it the stuff that's going on under the hood. Everything in blue is an active self, which really refers to embodied process. So an active cognition is a new term that it's actually an old term, but people are using it now in terms of trying to describe what happens in embodied cognition or non-conscious forms of processing.
Are you saying inactive or inactive?
Inactive.
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 Like it says up there.
Yeah, inactive. E-N-A. So meaning that it really is just an embodied form of processing. And the way it works is that there's a feedback going on constantly between sensory, affective, and motor processing. And that feedback basically is what's referred to as self-specification. You're defining yourself just by existing. You don't need to do anything. And that feedback that's happening continually through feedback between sensory and motor processing is creating a sense of self that you're not aware of, that you don't need to be aware of. But through training, you can actually get a little bit more familiar with. And so again, those are areas that are very sort of brainstem-like, thalamus. I'll try to walk you through some of these things. So the more posterior aspects of the insula, that's what this is referring to, posterior insula, and there's the anterior insula. Again, that's sort of represented in the folds of the sylvian fissure. The more posterior aspects are usually related to non-conscious sort of sensory or body, viscerosomatic processing. But what you see here is, what I emphasize here is integrated self-processing. So it's not necessarily that mindfulness is reducing the narrative completely. You need the narrative. You need to know where your sense of self is. And you need to also have very specific sort of processing going on in the moment. What mindfulness seems to be doing is strengthening the integration of those networks within each other. So you're able to flexibly move between them and update and continually update them in a very sort of integrated way. So, for example, this area here, the dorsal anterior cingulate, seems to be another one of those big brain regions that's modulated by mindfulness practice. And what we think the dorsal ACC is doing is that it's detecting, or it's really monitoring your every moment of experience. And what you see in 8 weeks of mindfulness practice is increases in the actual size of the dorsal ACC and things like the anterior insula and lateralized structures of the frontal cortex. This strip of cortex here that goes over the corpus callosum is called the cingulate cortex. It basically communicates between the cortical areas and the more subcortical and limbic and brainstem regions. So it's going to be directly connected to everything that's limbic and cortex. And the dorsal ACC seems to be really important for monitoring what's happening. And I'll show you in a model that we have of the meditation practice how monitoring is critical. Right. And then there seems to be really important aspects of intentional function. So intention, just the intention to sit and to continue sitting is really powerful. And that seems to be active also in these premotor areas and parts of the striatum or basal ganglia caudate. Things that are usually responsible for motor function seem to be active also when you're meditating. And these are all based on a lot of data that's out there, but also some of it's kind of speculative as to what we're theorizing is happening. Does that make sense of all the three sort of aspects of sense stuff? Yeah. Oh, so there's two. Wait,
Can you comment on how you've measured all these? Is it with functional MRI?
So most of what I'm commenting on here comes from existing data that's out there. And if you want the sources, you'd have to go to the papers that I mentioned in the beginning. But most of it is MRI, either through morphometric types of analyses that look at the structure changing of gray matter in terms of its volume over 8 weeks of practice, or in long-term practitioners. Over 8 weeks of practice, you've seen increases in size of the dorsal ACC. That structure right there, dorsal ACC. And so that's, and the AIC, the anterior insula. So it actually changes in size. What we don't know is what that means. Because if I taught you how to juggle for 8 weeks, that parts of some of these same structures will also increase in size, because they all require some form of concentration. But there's different patterns that are explicitly unique to meditation that will involve the places in orange specifically, okay, in terms of what changes in size. But in terms of activity, that's what we think is also integrating aspects of self-processing. So we don't know for sure yet, but we think that there's going to be changes in connections anatomically and functionally between the brain regions responsible for each aspect of self-processing. And there's some data to suggest that as well. Does that make sense? So this is a model, but it's based on the data that's existing.
And when you say size, is it more neurons or strengthening the connections across the existing
So
neurons?
this is really sort of it's a really good question, because we don't really know. When we see these changes in size of structures, we know that it's unlikely that it's neurogenesis, meaning that there's not new neurons being created. You're born with 100 billion neurons, or more actually, and think of those neurons as like a big telephone network that Verizon created without connecting any of the lines. So there's no network, there's just telephones across the world, 100 billion of them, and none of them have been connected. So that's gray matter, and you're born with all those main units, those telephones, but over time what happens is synaptogenesis, so meaning that so you have dendritic arborization and synaptogenesis. So dendritic arborization means that you're creating new dendrites and connections, so the network gets connected. And then you have synaptogenesis, which means new synapses are being made and connections are being made between the neurons over time. And so what we think is that there's probably more likely that dendrites are being created or synapses are being formed, or that there's some support structures like glial cells that are actually growing in size that are helping sort of support as support structures. We don't really understand exactly what's happening, but we just know it's increasing in size. Yeah? Make sense? Yeah. Anthony?
I don't want to take any more of the time because I know we're running.
Oh,
So.
sorry.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, given time, we'll move ahead here. So how do we get mindfulness to 3 practices? I think we're all familiar with these. I'll focus on just one, the open monitoring practice. Okay? And we can move forward. Okay, you can click next. All right, so I'll walk you through this. And basically what we start here is with the framework of motor learning. So just like riding a bike, you have to practice. Practice, practice, practice. I'm sure anyone who's done meditation, which I think we all have now, is that the goal is practice. So once we know that practice is important, that's what's going to sort of unravel all the maladaptive automatic behaviors and make more adaptive strengthening of strong connections between the areas that we want. And we start with intention and motivation, because if you don't have this intention and motivation to actually get any sort of improvements, then you're not going to improve. So intention is actually quite strong. It's quite strong throughout the practice and off the cushion. Continue. Set formation is an executive function. How do you maintain the instructions? What are you supposed to do when you're sitting on the cushion? What are you supposed to be doing? You're not supposed to be thinking about what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be just doing. So what is that? That's next. Is ambient forms of attention and working memory. Ambient attention refers to, and this is an open monitoring practice, so you're not focusing on any particular object, but you're orienting, next, and alerting towards anything that arises in your sort of your mental consciousness. As you sit, so I break this down into 3 modalities: visual, auditory, and somatic, and they can be external or internal. So it can be external visual information or internal imagery. It can be auditory sounds like the fan of the projector, or it can be just your own mental chatter, so on and so forth. And somatic is body, what's going on inside the body or just touching you. You can note and label, next, the arising or the experience of, or next, the passing or the absence of those stimuli. And arising and passing, mental noting and labeling is a very specific technique that's used, and we're using this as a model to basically deconstruct mindfulness into these component areas for investigation. So we can ask practitioners to focus in any one of these areas and investigate these things. So alerting and orienting are very significant components of attention that we can study at individual sort of component level. And this is the practice. We just continue. We disengage from anything that arises. We just note it, label it, fine, and then we go, continue. And that's the practice. But what we all know is that there's a distraction usually, and there's some sort of affective response with, you can click next, which is a memory. Something will come up, and that is habitual, and it leads to this cycle that repeats itself. So you can click one more time. That what we think of as rumination. This continues over and over again. We all know that. But how do you get out of that? That's the biggest key. It's how do we get back to what we're supposed to be doing and disengaging and going back to what you're supposed to be doing, which is that. How come our working memory is not functioning? Because we need to be aware that we're ruminating, and that's not what we're supposed to be doing. So the critical piece, we think, is this executive monitoring function. So I remember I told you the dorsal ACC is really important. And why it's important is because it's really important for its functional significance is for monitoring. If you click next, what we think is that there's a psychological process that's happening, what we call decentering. Most of you are probably familiar with it as diffusion or reperceiving or psychological distancing. The idea is just getting a larger perspective from oneself. That, we think, is the critical process that changes as it strengthens your ability to monitor yourself. And continue. And what happens is you, again, are able to inhibit your impulsive sort of behaviors. There's very explicit neural substrates for that. And regulate your emotions, and we can study that as well. And what we think is that equanimity results from these processes working together. And equanimity, what we think is what refers to is this ability that sort of is cultivated along with mindfulness, or mindful awareness. So that discriminative attentional capacity arises with equanimity. So the ability to experience an emotion fully and come back down to baseline rapidly. So most of these Buddhist models will talk about destructive emotions only because it's perseverative or it persists, and you're clinging and you're craving and you're attached to that emotion. But if you can experience anger, for example, and then come back down to your baseline rapidly, it can be constructive. And Paul Ekman and His Holiness the Dalai Lama have a big conversation about the constructive aspects of anger. So anger can be constructive as long as you have compassion for the actor who made you angry, and you're able to get your point across, but then come back to your baseline. So equanimity is really important, and that leads to your ability to disengage, and you're back in the middle to your practice, and you can click one or two more times. The mental noting and labeling eventually goes away, and you gain this sense of clarity. So gaining more clarity as you continue to practice, so you're seeing things as they truly are, you're enhancing your phenomenal intensity in which you experience the world, and your biases are decreasing. And so this is all part of the model that we've created for this particular practice, and effort decreases. So there's 6, that's okay.
Sorry.
You can go, that's good. So we can go forward here. So we've created sort of 6 components of mindfulness and how it functions in this practice. Intention and motivation, attention regulation, stability, control, and clarity, emotion regulation and equanimity, extinction and reconsolidation of sensory, affective, motor scripts and schemas, and prosociality, and decentering and non-attachment. So these are the 6 components that we've sort of now outlined in a framework of self-processing, and we can study that and see how these things change as people continue to practice. Okay, so how much time do we have here? Not much, right? So
how much time do you need?
well, no, I have slides of so we did a study recently, and I do have some pictures of the brain with images. If you want to see them, I can quickly go through them.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, so we did a study with adult meditators. Actually, Susan was part of the study somewhat in helping with host some of the practitioners that came. We had 20 practitioners come from out of town all over North America. Over like 250 people who were meditators, advanced meditators, wanted to be part of the study. We had to the hardest part was finding no history of psychopathology or drug abuse and addiction. Very difficult. So it was one thing to have no current psychopathology or drug addiction, but no history of it was harder because you can imagine a lot of people come to meditation through having some sort of psychopathology or drug abuse or addiction problem. None of them, all of the people who had a history were able to actually essentially cure themselves through their practice. And that's another question. What's happening there? But in terms of brain studies, we know that drug addiction, drug abuse, and psychopathology all change the brain. So although we want to get a sample that's, provides you a sample of what people really truly are, which is a mixed bag of meditators, we wanted to be able to study the brain at a very clear level. So they had mixed levels of experience, up to 10,000 hours, over 10,000 hours of experience. So they came and they sat in our lab for the whole week, and they did a retreat with Shinzen Young, and during that time, there's a few of the practitioners there, and during that time, we tested them. And so we can go to the next slide. And I'm only going to give you a quick background of Shinzen's techniques, but he's very explicitly trains you in mental noting and labeling, those modalities that I talked about. So we can just go to the next slide, and I'll tell you about each state. So we have C-rest. There are very specific states. Remember I said you can note and label the arising, the passing, or the rest of each modality. So the rest, C-rest, for example, is to focus on the visually restful state that comes about when you let go of involvement with outer sights and inner images. With eyes closed, you focus on the darkness that you see in front of or behind your eyelids. It's like a grayscale, blank mental screen. So you're just focusing on the absence of any mental image. It's a very explicit technique. Okay? And here rest is focusing on the absence of mental thought. And he has very explicit ways of doing this, which are very interesting, that are worth exploring if you're interested. And then feel rest is focusing on physical restful state, so the ability for your body to just relax, and you're noting and labeling the absence of tension and the relaxation of your body. And do nothing, which is similar to choiceless awareness, which is similar to what we were referring to as open monitoring. And in Dzogchen, Mahamudra practice is what is referred to as open presence. It's really just being open to wherever your mind goes, but maintaining awareness. Okay, so we did some contrasts between some of those states and mind wandering. Now, unfortunately, it's in imaging studies, you have to have a contrast between the state that you're interested in and some other state. And what we've always used since imaging started was what's called mind wandering or rest state. And what the instructions are, let your mind freely wander. And that's supposed to be rest, or baseline for human beings. And unfortunately, as we all probably are familiar with as meditators, we know that our mind is not really resting when we're just letting it wander. It's evaluating and thinking about the past and future. And what turns out is that we have this network of brain structures that have been termed the default mode network. Has anyone heard of that? Okay, so that's what we talked about, was that hippocampal cortical memory system. It was the narrative self network that we were referring to. Those are the areas of the brain. That's what we normally do when we're wandering, is we're evaluating the past or the future. And that's what you see most robustly in humans across all studies. That's what happens. So these meditators, you gave them that instruction and they said, well, where do you want my mind to wander to? Like, no one's ever asked us that before. Okay, well, if you have trouble spontaneously doing that, then we ask them to evaluate in some way where you are, what's happening, what's going to happen to you. So that's how we dealt with that. Okay, so let's show you some of the data. Oh, so we also asked them to, if you press two more times, we indicated with a button press when you have felt you've reached a peak state of clarity. And this can also be described as clear contact with a state that is intensely present. Okay? And then if you grossly lost concentration, we asked you to press with a thumb. And if you went back into a stable state, you would press with your index finger. So at least instead of just trying to model this whole 5-minute period of meditation, we want to know when they were actually doing well in the practice. So we do, through very highly complicated sort of techniques, we can eliminate the motor movement in the brain responsible for pressing the buttons, and then we can model the experience of the meditation state. So if you go for, so this is all pilot data. We have not published this yet. But this is really just 2 subjects, and it looks a little messy just because it's only 2 subjects, but it's the whole brain analysis. And if you click once now, what I'll walk you through here. What's interesting is you see like a lot of activation in the frontal parts of the brain and a lot of deactivation in the more posterior parts of the brain. But what you see is increased dorsolateral and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay, very big increases there. Strong decreases in parahippocampal and hippocampal areas, the limbic areas, amygdala all went down. Increases in anterior insular cortex. So remember the area that's important for body awareness.
Was this functional MRI?
Yes, this is functional MRI. So MRI is really just about structure. So you get a high resolution image of the brain through MRI, and then functional MRI really just gives you metabolic sort of changes in hemodynamic blood flow over whatever time that you're interested in. There's like a 12-second sort of lag that happens between every sort of stimulus that you see. It takes 12 seconds for your blood to go from oxygenated to deoxygenated hemoglobin, and that 12-second curve is modeled and overlaid on top of the anatomy. Okay? And so, again, and the increases in caudates or basal ganglia, so we think it may be related to intention to act, which also may be related to the finger press, that there is an intention to get ready to hit the button. There's strong areas in motor cortex, so motor cortex and sensory areas. So sensory motor areas are highly active, so there's very strong concentration in sensory motor. And the precuneus areas, the areas responsible for the narrative processing, went down. And this one also, each modality had a very specific activation and deactivation, but most of what you see is what we showed you in the models already. These activation in these integrative brain areas, decreases in the narrative self-processing, increase in ventrolateral, dorsolateral, sort of very highly concentrated areas, and you can go to the next. So it really starts to fit the model, and we're just starting to test different states and map the meditative mind is the sort of the whole sort of goal of our studies as we continue. You can so our take homes here is mindfulness is a method for improving self-awareness, regulation, and transcendence. Can be cultivated by specific concentration, receptive, and ethical enhancement styles of practice. And you can benefit by calming the mind, gaining a sense of meta-awareness, reducing excessive evaluation, judgment, rumination. Thank you. So that's pretty much all I have to say. But I do think the most important thing is the next slide for you to take home is the raincoat and one other, the towel. Please remember those 2 metaphors. It's probably helpful in your practice and your with your clients. So thank you again for listening. I apologize.
So let's take about a 10-minute break. Meet back here at 20 after 9. That'll give us about 25 minutes for questions and discussion.
I want to ask with your help.
Yeah.
I've designed a course called What Would the Buddha Say About Recovery?
Nice.
It's not substance abuse recovery, but